So welcome back, everyone, to our final session of the day. This session is entitled Building Democratic Social Choice into Recommender Systems. And it will be moderated by Peter Loewen. Peter is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto, director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and an associate director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute. Loewen's work has appeared in numerous academic journals, and he has edited 4 books and is a regular contributor to the media, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and the National Post. Peter?
Well, thank you very, very much, Monique, for giving me this chance to moderate. Very pleased to be at this conference, and very pleased indeed to be moderating this particular panel. You know, it's a remarkable thing to go onto the internet. It's a very daft general statement, but it's a remarkable thing to go onto the internet and to want to get something or consume something, because we have, in the course of building up these platforms that we have, developed incredibly complex, sophisticated, and maybe helpful ways of recommending what people should see. So those algorithms that suggest to you what Netflix movie you might want to watch, the algorithms that suggest to you what YouTube video you may want to watch next, or the item that you may wish to purchase on Amazon, are all of a class of recommender systems. And I think policymakers, just by way of introduction, are becoming increasingly seized by the question of how we build out recommender systems which embody the values that we think are important collectively within our societies. And sometimes there's not always tension there, but other times there are, and we can articulate those a bit as we have this conversation. But it's only by way of introduction of saying that it's a very important question about how we should design recommender systems versus how they in fact are designed. So to help us kind of wrestle through this question, we've got 2 great guests with us today, who I'm very pleased are joining us for Absolutely Interdisciplinary for this final panel. The first is Jonathan Stray, who's very well known to most, if not many of you. He's a senior scientist at the Berkeley Center for Human Compatible AI, and he works on recommender systems. For a decade, he's taught the double masters in computer science and journalism at the Columbia Journalism School. And he's also worked previously in the development of, for example, Workbench, the visual programming system, and Overview as well, and has also worked as a journalist. So we're really lucky, Jonathan, to have someone with the breadth, I think, and the many kind of sightlines that you have into these questions, and also joining us. So thank you very, very much for coming and joining us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan in just a second. But before I do, I also want to introduce our other guest today, Taylor Owen. Taylor is a professor at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University, where he's also the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications and the founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy. He is the editor of many works, including Disruptive Power, The Crisis of the State in the Digital Age, and a great book, a great edited volume called Journalism After Snowden, The Future of the Free Press in the Surveillance State. And I'll just say that for purposes of disclosure, that Taylor and I work together, I'm very pleased to say, on the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is a large scale, both social data and survey project to kind of understand what Canadians are consuming in the information ecosystem. So Jonathan, I might just start with you. This is a really important set of questions, kind of on a going forward basis, about how we go from where we are now with this very actually effective, impressive, massive set of recommender systems, which are really shaping our information environments on the internet, and how we get from there, if at all possible, to one where we democratize the design of these, I guess under the assumption that since they matter so much what people see, there should be some public control over them. What do you have to say about this? I'm going to turn it over to you, and the floor really is yours, but just help us understand where we are now and where we're going and what some of the possibilities are. And thank you so much for joining us here at Absolutely Interdisciplinary.
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. It's a particular delight to be returning to the University of Toronto. It's my alma mater, but I have never given a talk here before. So it's fun to be back and collaborating, and good to see Taylor as well. We crossed paths at Columbia. I'll be curious to see what you're up to.
Yeah, good to see you.
All right, so I've prepared some slides here, and here we go. Okay, building social choice, democratic social choice into recommender systems. So first of all, what are we talking about and why don't we care? So recommenders are the largest deployed artificial intelligence systems just in terms of user base, right? So Facebook has 3 billion users. There are not many people in the world who do not interact with one of these systems on a daily basis. Recommenders are kind of a weird name. If we could do it all again, I would try to call them information filters or personalized information filters. And they go through a bunch of stages, right? There's some big set of items. We remove some set of them that we don't think are appropriate, which is often called moderation. And then we filter them down progressively into a much smaller set. And today I'm going to be talking about mostly this set, what we call ranking or engagement prediction. Recommenders are inherently social platforms. It doesn't really make sense to talk about a recommender serving a single user. Classically, there's sort of at least 4 categories of stakeholders we talk about. Obviously, the user or the consumer is who we're normally thinking about. But of course, the creators or producers, the people posting things or providing content to Spotify and Netflix and so forth are important stakeholders, as is the system operator itself. Recently, there's been more attention on interactions between users. So how what I do on a platform affects you, or even people who don't use the platform. So the classic example of that is, your favorite restaurant is too busy because too many other people are going there, have been recommended it. To sort of frame what we're talking about, I like this idea of the society in the loop model. It's a sort of expansion of the human in the loop model, which says that there is a human who is working collaboratively with a machine to accomplish some end and sort of regulating the operation of that machine. When you expanded that to the society level, you hit an important problem, which is that people don't all agree what should happen. So that's why this says AI system with contested function. So that's what we're trying to do here, is we're trying to sort of set up this loop between the people, the various stakeholders, and the machines. I'm going to talk about a 4-level model of how to do that today. How to democratize recommenders at the policy, operations, and algorithmic level. And in particular, there's a couple feedback loops I want to talk about here. First, notice that it goes between the users and algorithms. That's the point where we'll see classical social choice theory, voting systems and so forth, and also feedback from the users to policymaking, which is the essence of democracy. So let's talk about recommender policy first. Now, there's been quite a lot said about this, including at this conference, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you're all familiar that there's various types of regulation have been proposed around recommender systems. So various transparency efforts, various ways to assess or manage a wide variety of harms, or various sort of process requirements, such as appeals processes or risk assessments. And these are all sort of envisioned as top-down, usually legal requirements, although versions of these also happen within the policy teams of the platforms themselves. But this sort of leaves open the question of, okay, well, where do users and citizens come into this? On the computer science research side, there have been some interesting attempts to directly design the ranking function of a recommender system in a participatory way. This was from a project called We Build AI, where they were rebuilding the system used to match donated food. So it was a 3-part match. They had to match a grocery store with extra food, a volunteer driver, and a food bank recipient. And so what they actually did is they interviewed all these stakeholders and worked with them to so that they would each build a linear ranking model. And then these models that represent different stakeholders actually, oops, come on, go back. There we go. Actually vote at runtime to produce a final aggregated output. So this is sort of direct design of a ranking function. But we're probably not going to do this for complicated ranking functions. This is not going to pick your next YouTube video or what you see on Google News. Those systems are really too complicated to be amenable to this type of thing. So instead, we could look at the outcomes of those systems. This is a leaked slide from the Facebook files, which shows one of the largest and most comprehensive experiments ever undertaken about the effects of a platform. And what they did was they surveyed people across, I think it was 9 countries, about their experience of positive and negative social comparison on Instagram. So positive social comparison is, wow, I saw that video and now I'm really inspired to work out. Negative social comparison is, wow, I saw that video and now I feel really bad about my body. And they took this 100,000 user survey and they correlated it to what they saw and what they did on platform in an attempt to determine causation. But there's a bunch of challenges here. First of all, determining causation is very hard. I mean, yes, you can control for demographics and age and level of use and all of this stuff. But external events happening in someone's life is going to affect both their mental health and what they do on the platform. So it's actually quite hard, and we're just at the beginning of figuring out how to reliably attribute cause. The other one is that real systems have both positive and negative effects, as you see here. Both positive and negative social comparison are quite common. So how do we judge a system which is producing both positive and negative effects, and how do we set boundaries for the amount of harm or the amount of negative effect we're willing to tolerate and weigh off against the potential benefits? And of course, who decides? So this was an approach that I put forward in a paper a couple of years ago. And basically it says, well, the way to make sure that recommender systems are serving societal interests in a democratic way is to have the stakeholders design the metric that is used to manage the system. Okay, but how do you actually do this, right? This paper gave some examples of where something like this has been done at platform scale, but doesn't really say how to involve people or what this process looks like. And in particular, who has the authority to say what we should measure and manage to do? There's a bunch of interesting ideas around this. This is an idea developed by Beaverbrook, and basically the problem he's trying to solve here is you don't really want governments to make detailed speech regulations because that has implications on infringement of freedom of expression. And you don't really want platforms to make detailed rules as well because they have their own conflict of interest and are serving private interest, not public interest. So what do? Well, he draws on a recent strand of work where you get mini publics. You take a random sample of citizens, you educate them, you have them deliberate, and you use that to try to generate a sort of broad and legitimate outcome. So that, I think, is sort of the state of the art in thinking about how you actually set platform policies. Once the policies are set, then you have the task of translating them into operations. And this is not as simple as just writing the algorithm. So one of the major techniques that has emerged is the use of surveys to get ground truth outcomes. So we're probably all familiar with the idea that you can't really determine the value of a recommender system just by looking at what people clicked on or watched. You need some sort of type of information, but you can just ask people, and most platforms do. And then what do you do with the survey data? Well, if you actually want it to drive the design and operation of the system, you have to assign it as a performance indicator for that system. And in fact, there's a bunch of evidence that this happens. This is a public post where he said he was changing the goal he gives the product teams to the output of this survey. But because of the Facebook files, we actually have far more detail about this. So this is one of the documents in the Facebook files, and this is from a long document which describes how to perform experiments on changes to the newsfeed, which are happening constantly, right? These systems are being constantly updated, thousands of changes per year. And what it's saying is, here's a list of metrics that if your proposed change is going to move them by more than a certain amount, you have to go talk to someone. And then it has this like 4 or 5 pages where it just looks like this. It has the internal name of a metric. It says the threshold after which you have to go talk to that person, and then it gives the presumably an email address of that person. And it's everything from like, the number of games people are making to the number of people who are meeting some engagement threshold, which they think is socially relevant to this meaningful connected construct. It's got things like this NEQ rating, which I believe stands for News Ecosystem Quality, which is some metric that they've developed to try to understand whether people are sharing quality news from quality sources or not. It's got the number of links, number of items that have links to political content. So you probably want to monitor that. You want to know if that's spiking or crashing in response to changes in the world that maybe you should look at. There's hundreds of these that are actually modeling. So the actual process of optimization at the corporate level looks less like a single algorithm optimizing for a particular target objective and more like a complicated negotiation between multiple teams who monitor different metrics, or if you like, a constrained multi-objective optimization problem, as you would say in computer science, but done by humans, not machines. The third level I want to talk about is the algorithmic level. And at least within computer science, this is where most of the discussion has happened so far. So if you look at something like Reddit, the simplest form of a recommender system is a voting system. And there's two things I want to point out in this picture. One is, you're probably all familiar with the up and down vote buttons. The other is that you can pick the ranking algorithm, right? Currently it's set to hot. You can also set to the newest. Top is a different algorithm. There's a few more if you press these dots. So this is an explicit voting system which combine the number of votes in a relatively simple formula, along with other terms such as perhaps how old the post is, and comes up with a ranking that you can select between as a user. And in fact, all recommender systems are voting systems in some sense, in the sense that they combine the input of lots and lots of different people to generate a set of rankings for each person. There is some mechanistic process which combines their votes, although their votes might be thumbs up, they might be a star, they might be a star rating, they might be just whether someone bothered to click through the headline. This is a picture which actually sort of explains how an important class of recommenders work. So these are the people, these are the movies. If someone gave a thumbs up on the movie, they have a check mark. And what this is actually saying is that how the voting system works is you are modeling each person as having an interest in whether they like more popular movies or more art movies, and whether they like more children or adults. So you can see that this person with the red cap is really into more children's films and doesn't like art house films. And so they get Harry Potter and Shrek. And then it tries to classify the movies along the same axes. And then how it actually figures out what this rating should be is it multiplies their interest in art house by the art house-ness of this movie, and their interest in children's films by the children-ness of this movie. So this is a complicated voting system. And this is far simpler than the actual algorithms used by recommender systems, which now use large neural networks to make this prediction. But in principle, it's a deterministic, mechanistic voting system. Modern recommenders actually have a bunch of neural networks that try to predict whether you're going to react in a particular way, such as like something or comment on something. This is the sort of optimizing for engagement idea that is often talked about. They also include a whole bunch of analysis of the content of the item itself. So there's a predictor which says, do we think it's clickbait? And you see this negative term here would penalize that. This is often called the value model, and it summarizes a bunch of predictions of user behavior plus hand-weighted or sort of heuristically weighted properties of the content or the effects that we might be concerned about. And again, there is an underlying voting system here that is in principle amenable to social choice theory. If we want to go even farther, we can ask users for different types of feedback. So here's Twitter asking for a retrospective evaluation of whether someone enjoyed or found a particular thread interesting. Here's YouTube doing something similar. You may have seen one of these surveys asking whether they thought that this video was life-changing. In principle, this is the objective function, or can be part of the objective function for the recommender. You can ask someone to fill out a survey with whatever language you want. Of course, they may interpret that in all kinds of complicated or biased ways. But in principle, this is a place where the recommender system meets the ground truth as evaluated by users. Modern recommender systems have begun to combine both the classic engagement objectives and the user satisfaction objectives, such as by this survey. So this is from a 2019 paper on the construction of the YouTube recommender systems. And you can see we've got sort of two sets of predictions. One is, are they going to click on it? Another is, are they going to rate it highly if they ask, if we ask them survey? So you're using some users' survey answers to build a model of every user's survey answer, and that becomes part of the rating system as well. But again, you can think of it as a big sort of social choice machine. This is not simply a matter of designing a voting system that in some abstract sense is fair or beneficial. Because as soon as you change the algorithm, the users change their behavior as well. Users are strategic. In particular, publishers are strategic. I publish something to social media and I want people to look at it. Or I'm an artist submitting my songs to Spotify and I want people to listen to it. Although any number of people can consume the same item of content without competition, the same is not true from the producer side. There is competition for a limited amount of user attention. So all of the consumers or all of the content producers are actually in competition with each other. And as soon as you change the underlying voting system, they will change their behavior. So you don't really get to specify a societal outcome simply by specifying the voting system. You have to think about it in a game theoretic sense. And so this is sort of where we've got to on this topic today. There's beginning to be a strand of work that analyzes the game theory of recommenders. And in particular, the classic way of choosing content is simply picking the best content for each user that doesn't necessarily allocate the user's attention in societally productive ways. So concretely, you may wish to allocate some user attention on Spotify to lesser known artists in order to counteract the superstar effect in cultural economics, give less popular users, artists a chance to be heard, diversify content production, and so forth. And in fact, Spotify does this. They use a measure of the diversity of a playlist defined as the whether it contains songs from different tiers of popularity. And they try to optimize for both the popularity diversity of the playlists they present, and of course, the user engagement. They're trying to give users both things that they like, which would be matching users to the closest content, and to balance overall social welfare between stakeholders, considering, for example, the artists, which is the pursuit of better social welfare. All right, that's all I've got for you today.
Thanks very, very much, Jonathan. I know Taylor's going to come in here in a second. I just thought I might highlight just a couple of things that kind of jumped out to me that I learned and I think that are interesting. I mean, one is, and this is really a kind of a industrial corporate culture story as much as anything, but this notion of there being competing objective functions, not only within the algorithms in a sense, but also within the companies that are producing them. Is to me very interesting, right? And many of us will know people who work in kind of a social responsibility arm within one of the platforms, for example. But it sounds like they're, within the algorithm, some of these corporate internal battles are happening. And the second thing is sort of your final point, which I hope we can come back to and reflect on a little bit, which is how we think about not only kind of the democratic shaping of recommender systems, but how we think about the challenge here of, and this is a very ethical challenge, right? Of algorithms reflecting our preferences now versus the enlightened preferences which we might want to have, right? And I think we all probably, we spend any time on YouTube, struggle between our desire to watch a lecture and to watch another spoof video or something, or whatever it is that kind of pleases us in the moment, and kind of wonder whether or not there's an algorithm out there which will appeal to our better angels and make us into better people, and one that just appeals to our short-term tastes. Taylor, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll note, Taylor, because I think this is if you're comfortable, maybe this is an interesting angle to commit this on. You're one of the co-chairs of effectively a task force in Canada, which has, I'll let you talk more about it, but just as by way of intro, which has over the last couple of years wrestled with questions of how we should think about speech, basically online in essence, has actually made use of citizens' assemblies in that, but also in expert opinion. And I think it's an interesting, just maybe point of entry, because, in this conversation about what algorithms should be doing, we are in large part talking about what values, from a democratic perspective, we might want to have embedded in them, if at all possible, if at all desirable. So, I'll turn it over to you. You can talk about anything you like, but maybe that's an interesting point of entry to this conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Peter, and great to see you again, Jonathan. And look, I appreciate the chance to have these kind of conversations and the spirit of this event, because in the policy world that I'm very engaged with in this space, there's they're not always great opportunities to bridge these epistemological divides ultimately here, these methodological divides. And I think it's a lot more of this is needed. And already in your comments, Jonathan, there's a million follow-ups I have here that we can get into after this. But I thought, like, so from my perspective, I've been looking at this both in the Canadian context, but also this real shift internationally that's happening in the policy landscape towards pretty wide-scale governance models for what are ultimately algorithmic systems, large social platforms being the primary object of a lot of this regulatory focus at the moment. But beyond that, I think, beyond platforms, just large-scale platforms that are ultimately determined by algorithmic systems. So I thought I'd just make a couple comments about the role of recommendation systems inside those and how policymakers are kind of at least starting to ask some questions, I think, that get to this. All of this is in the context of where the shift has happened, though, which I think is, from a policy perspective, from an ex post focus that policymakers were sort of absorbed by for many years, of like how to punish content once it's out in the world, or punish behavior once it's conducted on platforms, to instead an ex ante regulatory approach, which is essentially how to look at the design and maybe affect the design of the systems to function in a way that's more aligned with, as Peter said, either our social values or our desired social outcomes or our democratic outcomes. And that necessarily places regulatory and governance focus on the algorithmic systems themselves. Because if you want to design better systems, not just punish behavior and outcomes, you need to focus on the design of these systems. So there is just increased regulatory and governance focus on that design and changing the incentives of that design itself. And let me just flag 3 ways in which I think that conversation is taking some shape, and we can dive into them. One is, how do we better understand the effect that these recommendation systems, these algorithmic systems, the effect they're having on society? And as Jonathan laid out, I mean, this is a really complicated question because at times some of these effects are in deep tension with one another. Diversity of getting access to a diversity of content might be a broad social benefit, but it also might drive people into certain exposure to content that, I don't know, we could think could harm them in some way, or could lead them down a radicalization path, for example. So like a lot of these values that we would see, or that are designed into these systems, are in tension with one another. We also just do not have a great sense at the moment of the exact mechanisms of harm potential in these systems. So a lot of it comes from either outside work, like the kind of work that Peter and my lab is trying to do with very limited access to data, or research happening inside companies themselves, which is obviously we get access to in some ways through leaks at times, but much of it, that work is hidden from view and is driven by certain interests, obviously. So this need for transparency to better understand these systems is a real focus of policymakers at the moment. And I think you can probably say it's like taking 3 forms. One would be, what data should the public have access to when they use these recommendation systems? So there's the digital service agreement in the EU's digital service agreement, for example, has an explainability provision in it that basically says, like, if you are being shown content by an algorithm system that is making choices on your behalf, there should be some function for you to see how those decisions are being made. Now, I am sure that is a much more technically difficult proposition than the people who wrote that law acknowledge, but it is there and it has been passed. Another is system identification. So as a user, should I know that the system I'm using is making certain decisions based on what data is that being made? So that's sort of on the user side, what data should they have access to? A second layer, though, is the data that researchers should have access to and be able to study. And both the Online Safety Bill in the UK and the DSA have significant provisions for research access to data. The European Digital Media Observatory is kind of, at the moment, probably best in class in developing codes of practice for how that's going to work. That will be replicated in the Canadian model, almost certainly. And I think countries and jurisdictions are starting to learn from each other there on like what data should be available in what format, in what level of security and privacy provision for researchers to better understand these recommendation systems. And I think we're on the path to figuring that out. And the third level is what level should regulators see? So what capacity should regulatory bodies, whether it be Ofcom in the UK or what's probably going to be built up here, which is the Digital Safety Commissioner in Canada, what access should those regulatory and oversight bodies have to themselves audit and understand these recommendation systems to provide some level of oversight? And I'll come back to the oversight model in a minute because it comes up again. So that's kind of bucket one. Like, how do we better understand the system as individuals, as researchers, and as governments, democratic governments? The second policy question, I think, that Jonathan really got into here is who should have control over these functions and how they work. And this, as Peter mentioned, is ultimately a normative question, because right now there isn't a lot of it. I'm not sure, the summary for this session mentioned civil servants, and I'm not sure in many cases that's going to be civil servants, frankly. Although the one exception is being implemented in Canada as we speak, which is C11, our Broadcast Act, which actually is giving power over the diversity and discoverability to our broadcast regulator. So some of those recommendation calibrations around discoverability and diversity that Jonathan mentioned in the cultural sector are actually going to be decided by civil servants in Canada. And that has been, as everybody knows here, the focus of a lot of controversy in Canada. But it is almost sure to happen, given where we are on that legislation. So that civil servants maybe not complicated. But citizens, one thing I can say for sure, so Peter mentioned we've done 3 citizens assemblies in Canada on these sets of questions on what they want digital governance to look like. And it's been just an immensely eye-opening process for a whole host of reasons beyond this conversation. But there is no question they want more user control. One of the first answers you get from all of these citizen assemblies, these are people made up from all groups, all walks of life across the country in every respect. And they all want more power. They all think that they have less and less control over their digital lives, and that control is concentrated in a smaller and smaller number of corporate entities. That is like an underlying variable to what their recommendations. The challenge is that leads many people to ask things of the policy system or governance solutions that will pretty clearly have some adverse effects. So one example of this is, should users have full calibration control over the filtering mechanisms of their social feeds, and what effect might that have? Right? I think that's a very open question, as Jonathan raised. Another is real name authentication. Citizens really want real name authentication, but that also has all sorts of potential downside risks to some potentially minority users on the internet, but users whose rights should be protected in these design decisions. But I do think from the policy side, there are some places where these new regulatory regimes are really stepping into this. Interoperability would be a big one in the DSA. DSA has pretty strong provisions for the unbundling of hosting and content curation, which could be a big deal and is actually kind of where some of the people, like where I think some of the, like Elon Musk has sort of hinted at, I'm not sure if he fully believes it, but Jack Dorsey certainly has said that's where he wants Twitter to go, right? To basically just be unbundle the actual distribution of the creation and the protocol from the filtering and the end use, either APIs or products. And that's actually, like, nudging in that direction is actually embedded in the DSA. So that's important to watch. And DSA actually has pretty meaningful opt-out provisions for filtering algorithms, that citizens have to be given an opt-out clause, a meaningful opt-out. filtering. Now, who knows how that will be implemented, but it's there. The last piece on that user agency one that often doesn't get talked about, but citizens absolutely want, is really just stronger data privacy provisions. I mean, these systems are all based on data collected from citizens or inferred from the behavior of citizens, and they know it and they want more protection. And rightly or wrongly, they believe that might lead to better outcomes in how the information they receive is determined. I think there's an open question whether it will or not, but that's what a lot of people believe. Okay, final category here is how do you hold these systems accountable? And ultimately, this is like where most of the governance work is going to happen, and where the infrastructure is being developed as we speak, and it's going to have a real consequence. And here really is this kind of what's in the UK framed as like a duty of care model. In the EU, it's framed as a risk assessment and risk mitigation model. In Canada, we're going to call it a duty to act responsibly, it looks like, which essentially puts a statutory responsibility, in some ways a legal responsibility, on platforms to design their recommendation systems and their algorithmic systems in a way that takes into consideration known risks and then mitigate those risks. So there's kind of three broad pieces of that model. The risk assessment model. These risk assessments are being developed right now in the EU and the UK. And platforms will be required to do them on their algorithmic systems. This will mean human rights assessments. It will mean closed box testing of their systems, I imagine. A whole host of best practices are going to emerge around that. And the way recommendation systems will work in their systems is going to be one of the central focuses, almost certainly. The second piece is, if risk is determined in these systems, what are the codes of practice that are going to be obligatory to the platforms themselves? These are going to be codes of conduct in the EU case and codes of practice in the UK case. And those, interestingly, and where I think this is emerging as an interesting kind of multi-stakeholder governance model, is those codes of practice are being developed not just by the regulators themselves, but in pretty deep collaboration with civil society and academics. So I would imagine some of the things that Jonathan was talking about, like these kind of alternative models for changing platform design of these systems, are going to end up in these codes of practice. Where the governance becomes important is those codes of practice will not be voluntary. They are going to be required risk mitigation strategies for the platforms themselves. And that's a substantive move from where we are now, I think. And the final piece of that regulatory model is the liability provisions. So what do you do for systemic failures of this model? And that's where, I mean, ultimately the rubber kind of hits the road here, that if companies are not doing risk assessments, are not properly implementing codes of practice, where does that leave us? And there's a number of ways these regulatory bodies are going to be positioned. In the UK, it's 5% of global revenue for systemic failure to abide, plus CEO or named designate liability, which is a pretty big deal. In the EU, it's going to be percentage of global revenue. In Canada, it's going to be percentage of global revenue. There's also a move towards limited liability protection. So this is where you might see the US debate going, where are we putting conditions on intermediary liability protection? The JAM Act, the Justice Against Malicious Algorithms Act, which probably won't get anywhere, but it does do that. It puts Section 230 limitations for failure to spot and correct for algorithmic systems or recommendation systems leading to material injury, right? So I think we're almost certainly heading in that direction, maybe not in the US, but in other jurisdictions. So I think that's just some broad ways in which policymakers are thinking about this stuff. But obviously a lot of these conversations, and including the ones I've been involved with, are too often disconnected from the technical conversations. And so it's a pleasure to have it here.
Thanks very, very much, Joe. I appreciate that very much. It's a very, the combination of those two talks, Jonathan really giving us an effective masterclass in what some of these recommended systems look like and where they're going is very helpful. And Taylor, you giving us your insight into sort of where the policy world is on this is very interesting. Maybe I'll put a question to both of you, and I'd encourage folks to certainly put questions into the chat function so we can get you into this. But let me ask the following question to you. I read a paper yesterday that came out by Jason Reifer and some other colleagues. They use a conjoint experiment to show people features of objectionable speech online, and to ask them whether they think that speech should be constrained or not. Right, and the story that comes out of it, unfortunately, is both I'm trying to publish a paper. It's a well-known story, and it's also one that speaks about our kind of our sophistication as democratic citizens. People who don't like speech about a group that they're involved in are more likely to say that speech should be curtailed than those who are not in that group that is that's being harmed by the speech. Now, that might strike you as very obvious, and it might strike you as very fair. But for some people, the notion of restricting speech because it does harm is itself a problem, right? And this is all just a long way of saying that there is really a challenge here between speech we don't like and speech which is genuinely objectionable. And in Canada, for example, we've got a certain regime about dealing with hateful speech that will expose people to harm and to vilification and enmity. In other countries, there's less restriction, for example. I guess the question I want to put to you is in essence, can we trust citizens to actually draw the line in the right place? If we do in fact want to have humans in the loop here, how do we deal with the fact that humans actually aren't all that good at respecting the rights of people with whom they disagree? Jonathan?
Yeah, right. So going right to the hard ones.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, and in fact, the opening slide of my talk where I talk about the ranking systems, this is precisely because I was trying to sidestep the moderation debate. So I think there's maybe a few things that one can say. First of all, it might be okay if different communities have different speech norms. Indeed, this has been widely argued, especially at sort of the cultural level. But there are places on the internet where shit posting is great, and there are places on the internet where it's offensive and inappropriate and harmful, and that's okay. And so there are a variety of groups who are trying to sort of expand on this idea. The Social Futures Lab at the University of Washington has something called Policy Kit, which is a set of tools for trying to implement a comment or discussion moderation system of a community's choice within existing platforms. So I think there's one answer is this sort of like let 1,000 flowers bloom. I think you can say a few more things here about whether some rules should be universalized, particularly sort of hate speech. I find hate speech a pretty problematic construction for I think reasons that people have gotten into a lot. Just last week, the EFF posted an analysis of proposed UN cybercrime treaty, which had an extremely broad definition of hate speech that was being pushed by China and Russia, which could very easily be read to criminalize political dissent. So you got to be really careful with that stuff, especially when it becomes law or code. One potential advance here is the category of dangerous speech, which is distinct from hate speech, in which the question is not whether it is offensive or degrading, but whether it leads to real world violence. So I think some of these problems can be grounded in asking, what is the non-speech societal outcome that we actually care about? Now, this is very hard because thankfully political violence is quite rare. So establishing a causal connection is a difficult exercise, but honestly, I think that's the exercise that we have to go through, is to try to be clearer and more robust when thinking about the kinds of actual harms we care about, because plenty of things that do not qualify as hate speech have been shown to lead to violence, and plenty of things that do qualify as hate speech are completely harmless. So I think part of the issue is we may be looking at the wrong category.
Taylor?
Yeah, I mean, God, this is such a huge question, frankly. My challenge with a lot of those studies is they're detached from the way in which the policy is actually taking shape at the moment. So they take a category of harmful speech that no regulatory body, well, outside in democratic countries, are even talking about forcing takedowns on, right? So like take the Canadian context. Like Canadian context is a little bit complicated because as you say, our charter both protects free expression, but also protects in broad ways citizens from the effects of harmful speech, whether it's non-discrimination or incitement to violence, right? So like there's a real tension there that is much clearer in the US context. And so these are two very different conversations. And part of the reason these speech laws are going to be determined nationally, not internationally. The other reason being the autocratic one that Jonathan mentioned. Like there is no way we're going to get standardized content moderation policies across the world, let alone across democracies, because we all define these things fundamentally differently. So that's kind of the baseline here. But the question of the disconnect between how we're having this debate about limiting speech and where people are actually talking about it happening, I think comes into focus if we actually like get to specific types of illegal speech and what we're asking platforms to do. So like, is forcing mandatory takedowns of CSAM, for example, limiting the speech of child predators and pornographers? Probably yes, right? But that is something we broadly, I think, will agree that is tolerable in a democratic society. So like, okay, now we know that's a line we're okay with limiting speech on. And the mechanism as well, automatic flagging and probably automatic takedowns is what's going to continue to spread there. What do we do about other forms of clearly illegal speech that are far harder to automate though? Like I would argue hate speech is probably in that category. Like, yes, it's illegal, but it's very difficult to standardize and automate for a whole host of reasons, as we've seen in certain countries that have tried it. So we're probably not even talking about forced takedowns of hate speech in Canada. But what about something like non-consensual sexual images? So there's something where it actually doesn't matter, Peter, to your question, if you and I differ on whether an image you've shared of mine is harmful or not. If I say it's non-consensual, it's non-consensual. So should platforms be forced to take that down? I think probably, right? And I actually think, sure, that's restricting your speech to share that image, but I've said it's non-consensual. So it's non-consensual. So there's so many, what I'm getting at is there's so many different categories here. The last thing I'll say is on harmful but legal speech. So a lot of these studies, and I haven't read that one, so I don't know that one, but a lot of the work in the space takes a whole host of harmful speech and says, look, like different people disagree on whether it should be up or down, therefore we have to leave it all up. But that's actually not where what the codes of practice are saying at all. They're not saying this stuff is going to be forced to take down. It's saying if there is harmful effects, like maybe incitement to violence, or we know recommendation systems are leading people to anti-vax content, say. Like there's a great example. It's not illegal to post anti-vax content, but like broadly, we probably want platforms to act responsibly in what they direct content to, anti-vax, who they direct anti-vax content to. If they find that as a risk, that there is a lot of anti-vax, Amazon's recommendation engine is recommending anti-vax books when you search COVID. Like maybe there's a code of practice they should put in place to calibrate that algorithm in a more responsible way. Is that limiting the speech of anti-vaxxers? No, you can still publish your book to Amazon and sell it if you're anti-vax. It's just saying the algorithmic system is being calibrated in a way that are broadly minimizing rather than maximizing risk. And I think that's a very different conversation than we disagree about a fact, therefore one of us should be censored, which I actually don't think where the policy debate is really in a meaningful way anymore.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, Jonathan, if I could just follow on for 1 second, Jonathan, sorry, and risk really abusing my moderator privilege. I mean, I think that what Taylor's largely describing is kind of a system level way of thinking about this, right? Where we're sort of saying we want to reduce the total amount of harm, right?
Yeah.
I think one of the challenges we've got here, and this is really a challenge when we're thinking about how we democratize the design of these systems, is we don't think about rights being experienced in the aggregate. You know, I mean, our kind of adversarial system of justice and system of rights turns on the idea that, like, it's actually not a good enough response for you to tell me that the likelihood that I've been exposed to harm has gone down when I've been exposed to harm, right? I mean, what people, we have a system in which individuals receive justice for wrongs that are done against them, right? And that might well be the wrong way to run things. I could be very well persuaded of that, right? But the challenge here, I think, is in democratizing the systems is what people's, at least one of the challenges, is what people's expectations are, what a democratic system would look like, and what democratic process and procedure and experience would be, versus what we actually could possibly achieve at an aggregate level with some sort of regulatory tech.
Yeah, can I just really quickly on that? I mean, because that's such an important point, and it's one of the real, the core reasons this policy domain is really difficult, because the experience of harm is so significant and real for certain groups and for certain people who experience it, that the desire for a policy solution that is sort of close to 100% effective is very strong. So that's why we end up in notice and takedown regimes. That's why we had that's why we got NetzDG in Germany, is the desire to get rid of this problem, because for some people it is incredibly acute. The challenge is that then has all sorts of other negative costs around free expression, around civil society movements, around over censorship, right? There's a whole host of challenges to that. So that the systemic approach demands that we accept a sort of 90 or 80% effectiveness solution here. And I tell you, like, on these two different commissions I've been on, both have had representatives from anti-hate groups and from child sexual rights groups, sexual content groups, child rights groups. And it is not an easy conversation to say, you should accept an 80% solution to child pornography or to pedophilia predation on 6-year-olds, or to brutal hate speech and violence that is leading to incitement to violence against your community. Like, that is not a particularly easy conversation for us, let alone for politicians who represent those people.
Yeah,
so
you might be doing well at 80%.
Maybe it's 60%, right? Maybe it's 60%. Like, we don't know. We are going to know in a few years when some of the stuff rolls out, though. So, I mean, that's,
yes.
But if we go for 100%, it's not going to work.
Yes, Jonathan, you've been long suffering. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, hardly. No, I mean, I broadly agree with Taylor's characterization of the trade-offs and the problems in the space, and it's incredibly thorny. I do think there's sort of a little euphemism happening in many of these conversations, right? So Taylor, you said, if we reduce the spread of vaccine content, that's not infringing on someone's speech, right? It's a question of speech and not reach. And I find that argument disingenuous, because I think if you turn it around, you get the opposite answer, right? So if I am Twitter and I decide to reduce the spread of like LGBT content because it's causing, taking up a bunch of my moderator's time, or because of my politics, whatever, of course we would be up in arms around speech rights. So I don't think you can get out of this just by saying, well, reducing distribution is not a speech infringement, because it clearly is. I think we should be very clear that we are deliberately infringing speech rights because we think that those rights are, in that case, outweighed by something we want more as a society. And just be honest about that, right? People get into endless arguments about, like, it's not censorship, it's moderation. Whatever, those two words mean the same thing. They're just different valences attached to the same actual acts. And I think once you start thinking that way, then it opens the door to seeing certain types of systemic unwanted effects. So, for example, since the dawn of the internet, we've known that trying to remove something from the internet draws attention to it, right? This has been codified as the Streisand effect. There's now research coming out suggesting that online suppression of far-right groups, NetzDG, et cetera, has helped them spread their narrative and consolidate power. So the question of whether you can actually reduce the, let's say you're 100% sure that a particular political orientation is bad, which is itself a challenge, right? The question of whether you can actually suppress it effectively through online means, which, I mean, we're talking about, it's us. We're building it. Let's not delude ourselves about that fact, right? It's an open question whether it will even work, even if it would be morally just if it did work.
Yeah, I think John put it very well. It kind of gets to the part of the challenge here, right? That often the limiting of speech, well, Canadian law at least, but in other places, the limiting of speech has to be balanced against the good that it produces, right? So where that number is, Taylor, the 80% and the 10% is interesting.
Yeah.
An important one. Julian Hatfield, the director of SRI, you all know, has put a question in the chat. I'm going to read it. We've got some other great ones. She's asked, should we be expecting that we can find a democratic answer as to the values we reflect in recommenders at the scale of platforms? In our existing jurisdictional boundaries, Canada, the US, address this. What about more decentralized communities within large-scale platforms? So is middleware a realistic opportunity? Do we have different values on different platforms, and the people coming into the platforms then get involved in the conversation of determining the values of that platform in a democratic fashion? Is there a path there, Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, so there's experiments, right? So there's versions of the citizens assembly idea, right? So the Social Futures Lab, who I mentioned earlier, is also doing something called digital juries. And then the basic notion there is you assemble a bunch of people and you ask them, should this content be permitted or not? There's an NSF project, which is currently investigating the same sort of idea. Can we produce sort of gold standard moderation decisions from impartial panels of either citizens or experts, and then publish those and use that to guide platform policies? And then you can sort of go one level up from individual items, right? So Jillian just put in the chat, the question of, well, okay, but how do we have democratic influence over platform policies? And there's a variety of structures that in principle could do that. We talked about citizens assemblies. The Facebook Oversight Board is a very interesting example. There's a lot one could say about the strengths and weaknesses of that approach, but structurally it's interesting, right? Structurally it's novel. And also it's going to be really, really hard to give everybody personalized attention and appeals for when their particular post gets taken down, because the volume is just tremendous. I mean, if you look at bodies like the Facebook Oversight Board, right, they don't and can't adjudicate everything on the platform. They try to decide sort of precedential decisions. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot that we can do here. The central challenge is that people are going to disagree about what other people should say. It turns out people have opinions about other people's speech. Oh boy. So one of the ideas that I've been trying to bring into this is, let's bring the conflict analysis into it, right? Someone has just posted, used the word polarization and fragmentation. I think that online speech systems, including recommender systems and platforms, intersect very strongly with whatever the conflict dynamics of the underlying society are. And there's been a tremendous amount of work studying the conflict dynamics of speech in war, in places where there is physical violent conflict, mostly by fields such as peace building. And those ideas are just starting to get transposed into sort of pre-violent cases. And so, of course, the United States is a sort of exhibit A for that, but it's a system we're seeing in a lot of countries. And so then the question sort of zooms out from, how can I prevent people from saying things that I think might be harmful, to what are the enclosing conflict dynamics into which I am stepping by adjusting the policy of this platform, and how can I move towards a better conflict? Not necessarily ending the conflict. The predominant school of conflict in the peace building tradition is now conflict transformation, which says that conflict is normal in societies and it's part of how they change for the better. So you're not trying to end the conflict, you're trying to have a better conflict. And then of course, there's a long conversation about what constitutes better and worse conflict. but I do feel that some of these ideas could usefully transform the discussion of how we handle hateful and dangerous speech.
Taylor?
I think the shift from absolute harm prevention or conflict prevention to minimization is the right directionality in this conversation as well. And there are a whole host of mechanisms that can get at that. Like, I think meaningful interoperability makes a difference, because right now part of the challenge is we're in some ways locked in by network effects to a small number of platforms whose algorithmic decisions we're in some way captive to. So that's one. I mean, arguably, having more places with a broader range of rules that we are choosing to opt into over how speech is moderated ultimately is going to provide us with more choice and probably more options. Now, that will also lead to more fragmentation of our public discourse, arguably. So like that's an effect that will likely have. And that's something I think a lot of the sort of Web3 discourse we're getting now doesn't necessarily always acknowledge, right? That in all this pushback against centralized systems, there's going to be other material effects to radical decentralization and customization of individual closed online spaces that I don't think people are taking into full consideration. But the other piece here is that ultimately, what I think this risk assessment and codes of practice model is trying to do is just to nudge that incentive model that you were talking about at the beginning, Peter, that you have people doing product safety inside companies who are arguing for certain best practices to be followed, developed and followed internally, coming up against other internal incentives for the system, maybe for growth or for certain user engagement in certain markets, right? Like these are known tensions within these systems over how these systems are designed. Now, all this model is saying is let's try and nudge that incentive structure towards responsibility and product safety and minimizing harm. And that's not going to catch all of it, but it might help that incentive problem that we have right now, which is ultimately, if you're a large private corporation, you're incentivized to some of those financial metrics over potentially some of these others. And that's a very different conversation.
So let me just ask you to broaden out the conversation a little bit, and we'll try and get a bit of a rapid fire one here, and then we'll get a couple more in from the audience, but from the other participants. But in some ways, we're talking really about social platforms here. I think we're effectively talking about Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube as we talk about this, right? But what's the role for democratic regulation of recommender systems within commercial platforms, for example, right? Within how Amazon is recommending products to us, or even entertainment, right? How Netflix is throwing up some things over others, or Spotify over others. And the reason why I asked the question is following: is that these aren't really speech issues, right? But there are antitrust issues here, but they're also just issues about whether we think that so much of what's put in front of us in terms of cultural content, for example, should be determined only by private organizations, or should, like some Canadians believe, I don't, by the way, but like some Canadians believe, there should be some sort of national cultural imperative in recommending some things over others for broader reasons. What's the scope? What's the desirability of allowing democratic insertion into the recommenders driving commercial platforms, other commercial platforms, and what should the limits on it be? Sorry, Jonathan, I'm leaving you all the easy.
Asking you. Yeah, all the easy ones. Okay.
Taylor, you want to go first for this one? Neither of you do. Jonathan, I'll go to you.
So, I mean, all right. So first of all, I mean, yes, you could set connection working.
Yeah, you're okay.
You mentioned Netflix and Spotify as sort of perhaps less salient examples, but I'm not sure that they're actually any easier. So Spotify distributes podcasts, right? That starts to get very close to political news and commentary. And then on Netflix, we recently saw this whole row over the Dave Chappelle special, right? So even entertainment platforms are not immune from these types of considerations. There's nothing in theory stopping you from legislative setting of the editorial approach of a large platform. But I use that word editorial deliberately because I think that you start to have to get into the question of, well, why can I tell YouTube what to do, but not a newspaper? Or why can I tell Spotify what to do, or even Google News, which is an online platform, right, but not a newspaper? So I think you want to think very carefully about whether it is reasonable to have a government say what an editorial organization should produce or distribute. Of course, you can make the argument that there's something different about these platforms, and maybe that's reasonable. And I think the sort of strongest form of that argument, in the sense of depending on the fewest assumptions, is the antitrust argument. That Facebook is so prevalent that it is something different from a newspaper because there are multiple newspapers and only one Facebook. And that sort of leads to potential solutions such as middleware, right? Maybe we should require platforms to allow third-party ranking, although that is not a simple topic either because you have pretty intense privacy concerns.
Yeah, look, Peter, just quickly there. I mean, like, my challenge with that framing is that very often we end up conflating desired outcomes of policy objectives and what should ultimately be very different mechanisms for achieving them. So does Canada have every democratic right to apply its CanCon policy to new distribution platforms? Sure. Like, I don't necessarily agree they should either. But I don't agree with a lot of our CanCon policy, frankly. And I think this is an extension of CanCon policy on discoverability on platforms. And like, I don't really agree with the analog version of that either anymore. But so I don't agree with the extension onto platforms. Now, the online safety thing is a totally different objective. It's not it's about minimizing harm, right? And putting the right incentives in place to minimize the harm. And that's just a very different starting point with a very different objective, with a very different set of mechanisms. And so I think those two really have to be treated separately. And part of the problem with our debate right now, and in part in Canada, because the government's doing all these things at once, they've all become conflated. And these are really two very different objectives and two very different mechanisms, and they need to be treated as such and evaluated as such. One can agree with one and not the other.
Thanks very much. I'm gonna put one more question to you, which either of you, both of you, which is not an easy question. It comes from David Tickle, and the question is, underlying all this are the challenges of having informed and respectful public conversations and norm development in the context of polarization and a genuine lack of clarity. So let me just put a bit of an embellishment on this if I can, because I think it's a very good question. Leaving aside just the cases of individual harm, the deeper problem might be, right, that we're learning to have interactions with people in ways that are very unhelpful. In fact, in ways that are socially undesirable. And there's no violation of rights in that. Me leaving a stupid comment or saying something mean online is not a crime, but it's not a social good, right? And it might be the case that when all that's happening in the aggregate, we're in a position where we're actually losing the capacity to have empathic, constructive engagement with each other. Not agreement, but just engagement. So what's the kind of the democratic imperative here of not trying to solve an individual level crime of some sort or individual level harm, but just recognizing that there might actually be a larger societal problem emerging from the way we interact online that might actually be imperiling all of our our collective capacity to actually do good and to work together into the future. How do we deal with that democratically, if that is in fact a problem?
You want to go first this time, Jonathan, since you took the hit last one? So I share that concern, and I worry that a lot of these conversations about the worst kind of speech and the worst kind of content misses that. And frankly, a lot of the research, even the stuff that we've been involved with here, misses some of this, right? That like, it's hard to measure the decline of the public sphere or the unhealthiness of discourse in the digital public sphere. That's not an easy thing to capture through any mechanisms ultimately, but it could really be having an effect. And let me, one example of like this, so the amazing things happens with these citizens assemblies. So each one of them, we've had 54 citizens come from all over Canada to talk about how the internet should or shouldn't be regulated. They arrive at this event, this series of in-person events, thinking they are going to hate each other, thinking they disagree with each other, because they've been having the conversation about this very topic on the internet. They think they're fundamentally.
I didn't get that.
Oh.
Could you try again?
That was Siri picking up my, yeah, I said something close to that. I won't say it again, that word. But they're normalized into having this discourse online. So they come with their backs up. They think they're going to disagree with each other. They have all sorts of assumptions about each other, and they end up leaving largely agreeing with each other, and giving a fair amount to some middle ground on this stuff. Like it's really transformative. And that, to me, that tells us something about the character of the debate we're having online, to your point. Now, how you get that is it's a really wicked problem. I don't have any answers for it, but I'm not sure, I agree with you. I'm not sure we're calibrating the public sphere in the right ways at the moment. And that has an effect.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go back to saying I think that we need to take, speaking of interdisciplinary, we need to take conflict studies seriously. And this is one of the classical results from conflict studies, is that people stereotype the outgroup. And when they get together in person and actually talk, they don't actually disagree as much as they are, because nobody is actually, you know, the stereotype of that you know, fits the outgroup, right? It's a very small number of people. I did throw down a couple references, which are the two papers I know, which talk most directly about designing recommender systems for better conflict. One of them is mine, so take that for what you will. I think this, despite the fact that we've had at least 10 years of discussion, going back at least to the filter bubble book, I think very little is actually known about how to do this. And this is probably the moment to say that I actually write a weekly newsletter, which is not on technology, although it's sometimes intertext technology, called the Better Conflict Bulletin, which is all about trying to approach the US domestic conflict in a more productive way. So I'll throw a link in there.
Thank you very much for that, Jonathan. I'm gonna just thank both of you for coming here. And then if I might just take, because we've got 80 seconds once I stop yabbering. What's the one thing we should take away about what the future of potential democratic control of recommender systems will look like? Taylor?
It's happening. The horse is out of the gate or the barn, or whatever the analogy is here. Governments, rightly or wrongly, have recognized democratic harms and are stepping into the space. So the challenge now is how we craft that regulatory regime and those governance models in a way that balances those tensions that are clearly here as best as possible. And that's where I think the conversation is right now on the policy side.
Jonathan?
I would say that in the discussion around this, there's currently insufficient attention paid to the operational level. There's a lot of attention paid to the policy level, a lot of good work happening on the algorithmic level, people trying to understand the consequences of reinforcement learning. But in the end, a lot of the outcomes we see are the result of humans managing to a statistic. And so we got to get a hold of that and start thinking about what measures we're actually managing to at an operational level.
I want to thank you both very, very much for joining Absolutely Interdisciplinary 2022 and giving us the last 90 minutes of your time. I know I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope that everyone joining has learned this. So thank you, Jonathan Stray, very much. Thank you, Taylor Owen, very, very much.
Thanks, Peter.
That's great.
Thanks very much. It now falls to me to just say a few words on behalf of the Schwartz Reisman Institute and our director, Gillian Hatfield, and the University of Toronto. The first thing I do want to just say is thank you very much for attending Absolutely Interdisciplinary 2022. If you haven't done so, be sure to visit the SRA website to learn more about our mission, our research community, our upcoming events. We're a very dynamic group. We're growing rapidly. We're having a huge impact here in our university and globally, but we always want to build our community and our network. So if you can kind of check us out and drop us a line, we'd love to hear from you. Speaking of which, one thing that our community is doing is that on Thursday, June 23rd, that's tomorrow, SRI will host a special all-day AI bootcamp held in conjunction with SIOE, which is Society for Industrial Organizational Economics, I believe. And this event will take place in person at U of T's Faculty of Law and features presentations by Irene Chen, Dylan Hadfield-Mennel of MIT, Joel Labo of DeepMind, and Jonathan Stray of UC Berkeley. You can learn more and you can register for free on the SRI website. And with that, it's the Institutional and Organizational Economics. Thank you very much. With that, another absolutely interdisciplinary conference comes to a close. So thank you to all of our speakers and our attendees for your attention, for your continued engagement. I do hope that we'll see you all again as SRI continues to connect technical researchers, social scientists, and humanists in order to foster new ways of thinking about the challenges presented by AI and beyond to other powerful technologies. And as we kind of take up the challenge of building together a future that promotes human well-being for everyone. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone, and goodbye. Thank you.